A lot to cover. MashaAllah, saqakum Allah, sharabatuhu, yuqaddim wa yudimu alayka wa alayna al-sabr wal-hubb. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيبنا قرة أعيننا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. اللهم صل وسلم على سيدنا محمد نورك الساري ومددك الجاري واجمع لنا به في كل أطوارنا وعلى آله وصحبه يا نور. اللهم صل وسلم على سيدنا محمد صلاة ترضيك وترضيه وتنتوي بها أعمالنا ونياتنا وحركاتنا وسكناتنا فيه. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. Alhamdulillah. In our lessons on Mukhtasar of Imam Quduri alayhi rahmatullahi ta'ala wa nafa'na bihi, we've reached a section on Tayammum, which is dry ablution as they translate it. And once again, just like its companions, the Wudu and the Ghusl, which we've already taken, Tayammum and its rulings are found in the verse of purification, chapter 5 verse 6 of the Quran, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he's after talking about Wudu and after Ghusl, he says that if you are on a journey but if you are ill or on a journey, or have relieved yourselves, or have been intimate with your wives, and cannot find water, then purify yourselves with clean earth by wiping your faces and hands. And one of the two specific verses that talk about tayammum in the Quran, Allah ends it by saying that لا يريد الله بكم لا يريد الله أن يجعل عليكم من حرج ولكن يريد أن يتم نعمته عليك. That Allah does not intend to put any hardship on you, rather He intends to complete His virtue, His blessing on you. So one of the important aspects of all of purification, right, is to remember that haraj, right, that undue difficulty, undue hardship, right, is averted by the principles of the religion. That is one of the purposes of the religion, is to avert any undue hardship from any religious practices. So if one is in undue hardship or undue difficulty, and they find something to be really difficult or hard, or they're losing hope because of it, then that's a sign that they're doing things wrong. It's not attributed to the religion itself. Alright, tamam. So we find that the tayammum is textually established in the Quran in two specific verses, but also from the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. And he said ﷺ that أُعْطِيتُ خَمْسًا لَمْ يُعْطَهُنَّ أَحَدٌ مِّن قَبْلِي, that I've been given 5 things that no one before me has ever been given. Right? And then he lists them off. نُصِرْتُ بِالرُّعْبِ مَسِيرَةَ شَهْرٍ, I was given assistance by an awe that affects people from a month's distance. أُحِلَّتْ لِي الْغَنَائِمْ, that the war spoils were made permissible for me. And one of them, he says, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, جُعِلَتْ لِي الْأَرْضُ مَسْجِدًا وَطَهُورًا, that the earth was made for me a place of prayer and purifying, a means of purification. So the earth is a means of purification. Now tayammum, dry ablution, or using soil, is an alternative to using water. Right? And that's an alternative for both the wudu and the ghusl. Right? And the principle is that if the alternative, if a person cannot do that which is the regular, right, then they can go to an alternative, but they can't do both. That's the whole point of an alternative, is that you can't do both. You only do the alternative when the primary thing is not possible, right? And you can't do both the alternative and the wudu, which is the Hanafi school kind of differs with the Shafi'i school on that, because in the Shafi'i school there are certain situations where you would have to make tayammum and wudu. Right, so if you have, for instance, a cast or a bandage on an arm, and you didn't already have a state of purification when you put that on, right, then you would make the wudu except for that part. Right? And I'd say, like, a better example would be on the foot. So say you have a cut on your foot, so you have to put a bandage on your foot. So the foot is one of the limbs of the wudu. So because you're not able to do the wudu fully, you would do the wudu and you would do the tayammum. But then you would have to repeat the prayer. There's very intricate details that obviously is not my cup of tea at the moment. But you can ask the Shafi'is that. But we don't have that combining between something and its alternative. You can't find that. Right, so that'll come up. It came up already because we already talked about leftover water. Right? And one of the aspects of leftover water is the leftover water of a donkey or a mule. It's doubtful. There's different narrations that would assume different types of rulings. Right? So the ruling is that if you only have that water, you have no other water except for the water that a donkey drank from, you would make tayammum and wudu. Right? But not because you're doing both, but so that you have purification either by one or the other, not by both. So we cannot combine ones from the two. So go back to what we were talking about. So in the verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, if you cannot find water, وَلَمْ تَجِدُوا مَاءً, you do not find water. Now, the principal excuse that allows a person to go away from the primary, which is the wudu and the ghusl, to the substitute, which is the tayammum, is that there is no water. That's the primary excuse, that there is no water. Right? But the scholars have determined, because of that and for other reasons as well, that having water and not having the ability to use it stands in the place of not having it at all. It's as if you don't have it. So imagine you're in a prison cell. May Allah not allow us to be in a prison cell. But say you're in a prison cell and there's a whole bunch of water right in front of you, but there's bars in between. Right? You found water. There's water. You can see it right there. But can you use it? Do you have the ability to use it? No. So it's as if it's not even there. Right? It might as well be miles away. Right? Because your inability to use it is as if you don't have it at all. Right? It's just like the absence. Right? And also we mentioned just now that part of Allah's favor on this ummah is that He has removed all undue hardship in any act, any action, and any part of religious responsibility. There's no undue difficulty there. So if for you to acquire that water, there's undue difficulty, either in using the water or finding the water, then you're excused. It's as if the water does not exist. Right? So all of it goes back to that basic principle. Right? So you can break down the excuses to two things, really. One, right, there's an absence of water. Right? And that would include that you have water, but it's not enough to make a whole wudu. Right? So say for instance, your person needs ghusl, and all they have is this. Is this enough to make ghusl, even for the pious person, right, who knows how to make the sunnah ghusl? Right? This is even less than what the Prophet would use. Right? This is most likely more than enough for a wudu, right, but not for a ghusl. So having this much water is as if you don't have any water, because doing half of a ghusl doesn't count. Right? So when absence of water would include not having enough water, one. It would include having water but it's impure, right? And it would include that the water is there but it's too far away. Right? So for instance, you live here, 3 miles down the road, you know that there's a well. So technically there's water present. Right? But it being that far is undue difficulty, which is averted by textual Quranic verses. Right? The second would be that you have water but you're unable to use it. An inability to use the water is just as much of an excuse as not having water itself. Right? Because, again, back to the principle of undue hardship is averted in the religion. Right? So that would entail sickness. Right? So, say a person is in a place, they're traveling, and the only water that they have is absolutely freezing, and it's cold outside. Right? So for them to take off their Canada Goose negative 50 degree, right, Celsius jacket, right, bear the cold on their cold skin, and then on top of that add cold water to it, if they're reasonably sure that they would be sick, they would end up becoming sick because of that, they don't have to use the water. They can keep nice and snug, right? Maybe take their sleeves out, make tayammum, and then continue their life. Right? So they fear becoming sick, that's one of them, right? Or they're already sick, and they fear that if they would use that water, they would increase in their sickness. That's also an excuse. Right? And likewise, if they are already sick, right, and if they were to use the water, it would delay the process. It would delay them getting better. It would make the time that they would get better longer. That's also an excuse. So fearing the onset of sickness, or fearing an increase of sickness, or the delay of the cure, right? It's as if the water is not there, because using the water would be unduly difficult, and that's textually averted. Also, under inability to use the water, you have the fear of something, right? Having a reasonable fear that if you were to go to the water, you would be harmed in some way, right? Whether it be your enemy, whether it be a predatory animal. So, for instance, you're out visiting your friend in Mumbai, right? And he lives in the rural areas, in the outskirts of the city, right? And it's your plan to go visit where Habib Ahmed Mashhur al-Haddad is buried. So you're traveling, so you stop at this place midway, right? You're in this tent. Right? So it's time for salat. They say, okay, there's a well about 15 feet down the road. Right? It's close, very close. You can make wudu over there. You walk out the door and there's a lion standing right in front of the well. Do you have to make wudu? What if the lion is just sitting there? No, just taking a nap right in front of the well. Right? No plans to go anywhere. Right? If you were to wait, the time would go out. Right? You don't have to make wudu. You can make tayammum and pray, because that fear is for you to act contrary to what your instincts would be. It would be unduly difficult. Right? And that fear is reasonable. Tamam. Right? And likewise, the other ones fall into that. Right? So if you're on a journey and you have some water, right, but you also have another 30 hours of travel, and you only have this much water to drink for the rest of the trip. You need that water to drink. You don't have to use it for wudu. Right? If you could somehow use it for wudu and keep it, like have it drip back into a container, and then you can drink it later, you could combine from the best of both worlds, but you don't need to. You can keep the water for drinking and then make tayammum instead. Tamam. The last one is very unique though. The last one is very unique. You are allowed to make tayammum if you are in a situation that you fear that if you were to go make wudu, you would miss some prayer that there is no alternative to. There's no substitute to that prayer. Right? For the example, the Eid prayer, either of their Eid prayers or the Janazah prayer. The Janazah prayer is not, it's not repeated. Right? Even if, for those who studied before, even if the wali has the right to repeat it and other people prayed it already, he has the right to do it again, but only himself. No one else can join him. Anyone who already prayed can't pray it again. Right? So the Janazah prayer cannot be repeated. It cannot be prayed twice. The Eid prayer, there's no qada. You missed it, sorry, next year. See you next year. Right? So if you're at the Eid prayer, right, and all of a sudden you need to make wudu, but you see the line is all the way out the door and Imam already said takbir, right? There's no way you're going to make wudu and still catch the prayer, right? You can make tayammum, join the prayer and pray it. Right? Your tayammum is valid and the prayer is valid because only because that prayer has no substitute. And that applies to any prayer that has no substitute. Same thing with the janazah prayer, the Eid prayer. But in regards to the fard prayer, it is not permissible. So if you have 5 minutes till Fajr is over, right? And well, 5 minutes is a lot actually. You can do a lot in 5 minutes. You can make a full wudu or a full ghusl, right? You don't need to dry off. You don't need to read Surah Baqarah. You don't, right? You can do a basic prayer quite quickly and then repeat it later. But say you wake up 1 minute left till Ishraq, till Fajr is over. There's no way you're going to make the wudu. Can you make tayammum? No, because there is a substitute. What's the substitute of the fard prayer? Qada. You can pray it. Pray it as a make-up prayer. Right? So you cannot make tayammum. Same thing applies to the Jumu'ah prayer. What about Jumu'ah? And what's the alternative or the substitute of Jumu'ah? Dhuhr. Right? So if you miss the Jumu'ah prayer with the Imam, you can pray Dhuhr. Right? So you're not allowed to pray, to make tayammum, right, unless the prayer has no substitute. So that one is quite unique. The rest of them go back to either an absence of water or an inability of water. Now, if the water is too far, right, and I believe it's 1.72 kilometers, I believe it is, 1.18 miles, right, that's considered too far. So if it's more than, say, 1.18 miles, right, you don't have to go get it. Even if you have absolute certainty that it's there, you don't have to go find it. You don't have to go looking for it. You can just make tayammum. Because walking that far is difficult. Right? Some scholars, they mentioned, and this would probably be a bit strange in our context, but things are still relevant in very many places, that if you're traveling with a caravan, right, one of the opinions is that if you were to go to get that water, you would fall very far behind the caravan, then you don't have to go. So that was Abu Yusuf's opinion. But others, they took the opinion of the 1.18 miles. That's the mu'tamad, that if it's more than 1.18 miles, you don't have to go find it, even if you know that it's there. Right? Some scholars, they mention that if you're traveling north, for instance, right, you're traveling north, if there's water east, west, or south, right, if it's more than 1.18 miles, you don't have to go get it. But if it's ahead of you, right, that's the way you're going anyway, then they said double that amount, right, because it's not difficult, because you're going that way anyway. And that's an interesting outlook on the issue, right? And that definitely could be used for caution's sake, that if you're going to go that way anyway, obviously assuming that the time of the prayer is not going out, then that may be something one can do on a basis of caution. But there's still, right, 1.18 miles is the break-off point. You don't have to go to that extent. Tamam. As for the method of tayammum, Imam Quduri, he mentions, وَالتَيَمَّمُ ضَرْبَتَانِ. Tayammum is 2 strikes. And that's, he mentions this because that's the wording that is used in the hadith. That the tayammum is 2 strikes. And he continues, يَمْسَحُ بِإِحْدَاهُمَا وَجْهَهُ. He will wipe with one of the 2 strikes his face, and with the other his arms up to and including the elbows. Tamam. So there are 3 integrals in the tayammum. There's a bit of a discussion on one of them, but one is the intention. Right? Others consider it a condition. Right? And there's very little fruit to the difference that is found there. Right? The only way that would show up is if you go like that and then you break your wudu. Can you still use this? Right? How often is that going to happen? Just do it again. Yes. So intention, right? One, because water is naturally purifying. Right? So you don't need an intention in order for water to do its job. Allah says, وَأَنزَلْنَا مِنَ السَّمَاءِ مَاءً طَهُورًا. We sent down from the sky water, right? Purifying water. So it naturally is purifying. So it's not because of your intention that it purifies. Right? But soil, right? Its nature is to dirty things. That's why we call it dirt. Right? So how can it be a means of purification? One, because Allah made it a means of purification for His Prophet ﷺ, right? But it requires an intention, because it by itself is not going to purify anything. Right? It requires an intention. But the first main integral is to wipe the face. So after putting the hands on the ground, on the soil, and we'll talk about what kind of soil is used, right? Then one must make isti'ab of the face. They must wipe the entire face, every single portion of the face. That's within the scope of the da'irah, the sphere of the face, tongue twister. Right. Now, the dirt does not have to reach every part of the face. Right. It's not that you need soil to reach every part of the face, because once you wipe like this, pretty much it's already gone, if there is anything. Right. The purpose is not to dirty yourself. Part of the sunnah of wiping is that after you do this on the ground, on the soil, right, you knock off whatever is, right, because then you're going to dirty yourself, and that's not, right, our deen doesn't teach us to degrade ourselves, right? But the hand that has touched the soil must touch every part of the body, of the face, right, every part. Right. Now for the face, that's pretty straightforward. Just one second. But for the arms, there's important things to note. Right? The arms, same thing. After a second hit, right, knocking off the excess, which is a sunnah, right, then one has to touch every single portion of the arms, including the elbows. And the elbow, remember, the elbow is 3 bones, not just one. There's the 2 side ones, and then the pointy one in the middle. Right? All 3 must be wiped. Now, if a person has a ring, it's obligatory to take off the ring. It's wajib, I should say, necessary to take off the ring. In wudu, it's not necessary to take off your ring, right? If it's tight, you have to move it so that the water gets under. If it's not, then it's still sunnah to do so. If someone has a watch, they have to remove it. Right? The hand has to touch every part of the arms, including the elbows. Right? After that, the tayammum is valid. Right? The tayammum is valid. Right? And that is just one time. Okay? And the principle is that anything that has to do with wiping is only once. So when we talked about wiping the head, 1/4 is the obligatory, whole head is the sunnah, only once. Okay? Other madhabs, you'll find that they make masha 3 times. They wipe 3 times. Right? You have a question, Siri?
Yes. In terms of using Mukhtasar for wudu, if it were more in the past with rural areas, that would be more applicable. One of the questions I wanted to ask that, what if your working condition is somewhere where like let's say in winter there's snow, right? So you can't make wudu because you're covered, and there's no washroom nearby. And the other thing is that what if you're in a situation where there's only wood and concrete, like the ground?
Yeah.
Would that be applicable as
Well, we'll talk about what you can use to make tayammum, because it's not just soil. But you made a good point that if you're in a place that's really cold and using water would be difficult, but you're surrounded by snow, not dirt. Can you make tayammum on snow? No. Right? So generally, many of the righteous would actually keep a small pebble or stone with them. Right? If they travel or if they go on a flight or something, they would keep some sort of small stone. right? Because you can use that stone, right? And you can use one tiny stone for your whole hand, right? It doesn't have to be like hand size. Right? You probably get questioned at the airport if you have a large brick in your pocket, right? But that, right? But if one didn't have that, then you can find other things, right? We'll mention in a bit what you can use, inshallah. So that's the method, right? The face, the entire face must be wiped, and the entire hands must be wiped. Now, Imam Quduri, he says, وَالتَّيَمُّمْ مِنَ الْجَنَابَ وَالْحَدَثِ سَوَاء. The tayammum is a substitute for both the wudu and the ghusl, not just the wudu. Right? So if a person is in a major state of impurity, right, then they can make tayammum if they fit the criteria. So he says, وَيُجُوزُ التَّيَمُّمْ عِنْدَ أَبِي حَنِيفَةَ وَمُحَمَّدٍ رَحِمَهُمُ اللَّهُ تَعَالَى بِكُلِّ مَا كَانَ مِنْ جِنْسِ الْأَرْضِ. That he says tayammum is allowed, according to Imam Abu Hanifa and Imam Muhammad, Allah's mercy on them, right, with anything that is considered of the category of earth, right, of earth. In the verse that we quoted, the verse of purification, Allah says, right, then purify yourselves with clean earth, sa'idan tayyiba. Now sa'id is ma yas'adu al ard, right? It's the top soil, it's the top layer of earth, right? So that does not only include dirt, right, but it includes anything that would normally, naturally be found on the ground, on the top soil of the ground. Right? So that includes dirt, that includes rocks, that includes sand, that includes, right, and the criteria to tell what you can use, right, the criteria of what you're using is two, that it has to be pure, because he says sa'idan tayyiba, right, pure, clean soil, right, pure soil. We know generally if you're outside, right, and the ground is dry, it's pure. If the ground is dry, it's pure. Even if a dog urinated on the concrete outside, right, and then it dried up from the sun, and you don't see any signs from that, of that, it dried up, you can pray on that spot. Right? But you can't make tayammum from that spot. Right? Because it has to be pure. The place has to be pure. You can assume that everything outside is pure, unless you know for a fact that that's where the dog, you don't have to go crazy about it, but it has to be pure. And second, it has to be from the category of earth. The definition, an easy way to know that, is if you were to burn this substance, would it melt or would it turn to ashes? If so, you can't use it. It's not jinsul ard. It's not the category of earth. So how about wood? Right? Trees are on the earth. The root of a tree or something is there on the topsoil. If you were to burn wood, what would happen to it? It would turn into ash, right? Okay, how about metals, minerals and metals, or I should say metals specifically, right? What happens to them when you burn them? When they're exposed to fire, what happens? Say you found silver on the ground. Right? If you expose it to fire, it would melt, or at least it would become malleable. Right? So you cannot make wudu, you cannot make tayammum on silver or gold, right? Even though they're from the earth. Right? But sand, right, that's an interesting one, because sand turns into glass. You can't make tayammum on glass, even though glass is originally sand. So you can only make tayammum on that which is from the category of the earth in its original state. Right? So you can't, there's glass. Glass is from sand, therefore I can make tayammum on sand. No, you can make tayammum on the actual sand, but not on the glass. Right? So a rock, if you were to burn a rock, what would happen? A stone, you have a large stone, you just throw it in an oven, in a fire, nothing. Right? Unless you had like volcanic temperatures, then it would just become a different kind of rock. It'd become a metamorphic rock, and it's still a rock. Okay, so that includes soil, it includes sand, it includes rocks. Concrete would most likely be made of, right, sand. Right, there would be, right, things that would be of jins al-ard, so you don't really have to be too picky about it. Right, but it would be a good to do about concrete. Like to do a whole like bahth on what it's made of, because it's sand and water. What else? Anyone know how to make cement? He says, وَنِيَّةُ فَرْضٌ فِي التَّيَمُّمِ, and the intention is obligatory in the tayammum. Right, so one of the reasons why tayammum is obligatory, we talked about this a bit, so we won't spend too much time on it. One of the immediate reasons why tayammum is obligatory is because tayammum itself means intention. وَتَيَمَّمُوا سَعِيدًا طَيِّبًا, and intend pure soil. Right, Allah says, وَلَا تَتَيَمَّمُوا الْخَبِيثَ مِنَ الطَّيِّبِ, and don't intend to give the worst of your wealth instead of the good. Right, so tayammum it means intention itself. So the Sharia does consider linguistic meanings to have an effect on its rulings. It has an effect on its rulings. So the argument is, how could you say that intention is not necessary in tayammum when tayammum itself means intention? That's a good argument. It means intention. Right, so it's obligatory in the tayammum, and it's recommended, but we took it already, that it's sunnah, it's emphasized sunnah in the wudu. It's emphasized sunnah in the wudu or the ghusl, but it's obligatory in the tayammum. Now, what do you intend is a good question. Okay, what do you intend? The basis is that you're intending purification. I intend to attain a state of ritual purity, or the opposite is also right. I intend to remove my ritual impurity. That's fine. However, if one doesn't use that general intention and they use a specific intention, say for instance, a person wants to enter the masjid, right? Actually, this is a long bahth, we don't need to go down that road. But one must intend some sort of action that it requires purity for you to be able to do it. You have to intend an action that requires purity in order for you to be able to do it. So if you don't have wudu, but you want to read Quran, you want to grab the mushaf, right? You can make tayammum. If you fit the criteria, you can make tayammum and then grab the mushaf. Right? But can you pray with that tayammum? That's the issue. So the question is, is it allowed to touch the mushaf without purification? Can you? Are you allowed to touch the text of the Quran without wudu or ghusl or anything? No. Right, so you intending to touch the mushaf is intending to do an action that is not valid without purification. You can go ahead and pray after that with that same tayammum. Make sense? Okay. What's the ruling of reciting the Quran without touching anything, just saying it on your tongue? You don't have wudu, but you want to recite the Quran. And it's part of the etiquettes to have wudu when you recite the Quran, even if you're not touching anything. Right, so you want to make tayammum. Right, so I don't have wudu, I don't have water. I intend to make tayammum so that I can recite the Quran. Right. Can I pray with that tayammum? Why? You're right, but why?
Because the action doesn't require...
Good. I cannot pray with that tayammum because that action does not require purity for me to do it. Right. However, I throw a little trick in there. What if I needed a ghusl, and then I made a tayammum, and then I intended to recite the Quran? Do you need purification to be able to recite the Quran if you're in a major state of ritual impurity? You do, right? So if I was in a need of a ghusl, no water, so I go to make tayammum, and while making tayammum I intend to be able to recite the Quran, I can pray with that tayammum, right? Because in that case, because I'm in a major state of ritual impurity, right, reciting the Quran is an action that requires purification, and that's what I intended. Right? And there's only a few situations where this would apply, like for instance, a person in major state of ritual impurity entering the masjid, right, and so forth. The easy thing, just say, I'm intending to remove my ritual impurity. That's it. I intend to become pure. That's it. Or I intend to pray. You can say that, and everything else falls under it. I'm making tayammum so I can pray. Even if you're not going to pray right away, right? If you do that, then you can touch the Quran, you can recite the Quran, you can enter the masjid, you can do all of that. Tamam. Fiqh likes to talk about hypotheticals, and they're cool for the fiqh-minded person, but why even do that? Why even make such an intention? Just say, I intend purification. Bismillah 1, Bismillah 2. Right? So, good. And we talked about the difference, why the intention in wudu is not obligatory as opposed to the tayammum, because water is naturally purifying whether you intend it or not, right? And whereas soil is not. So the intention is necessary or obligatory. Now once a person has tayammum, right, so they made the tayammum, they wiped the entire face, they wiped the arms with the proper intention, right? Now just like wudu, you remain in that state until you break it, until you invalidate that state. You remain in a state of purification until you break it. Now what breaks the tayammum? Right? Anything that breaks the wudu breaks the tayammum. Because tayammum is a substitute for the wudu, anything that breaks that which is a substitute for breaks it. Right? But there's an additional thing. There's an additional thing, which is if the excuse that allowed you to make the tayammum is gone, the excuse is no longer valid, then the tayammum breaks immediately, even if you're in the middle of the prayer. Right? So for instance, there's no water whatsoever in sight. So you made tayammum, and you start your prayer, Allahu Akbar, right? Right before, right, you stand up for the fourth rakat, right? You're finishing up your Fatiha, right? And then boom, pouring rain just lands right on top of your head. Just starts thundering and storming and rain everywhere. Now there's water. Your tayammum is broken. Therefore your prayer is broken. Right? Because once this excuse is removed, that thing is not allowed anymore. Because it's only a substitute, and it's only a substitute when the primary thing is not possible. Now, what if it wasn't because of a lack of water that I made tayammum? What if I'm sick? And I know that any kind of water, and some types of skin problems, that they can't touch water at all. I had a classmate actually. Right? He used instead of going down the long medical description of what his condition, he would just say, I'm allergic to water. It was really interesting, right? But say this person, he needs to make wudu, he has severe eczema or whatever, right? Right? So it's not because there's no water, it's because they can't use the water. It would harm them. So if they're praying outside and then it starts raining, right? That wasn't their excuse. It wasn't because of an absence of water. So their prayer continues. Right? But if suddenly they were cured and the water doesn't hurt them, then their prayer would be, right? Their tayammum would break. So either anything that breaks the wudu breaks the tayammum. So if someone uses the restroom, or they bleed, or they vomit, mouthful, all the things that we talked about, that would break the tayammum. If the excuse remains, then they would just have to make another tayammum. Right, so say, for instance, you made tayammum to pray. Right? On your way to the prayer, you got car sick, you vomited a mouthful. Right? What do you do now? You just make another tayammum. Right? Right, so anything that breaks the wudu breaks the tayammum. And second, the excuse that permitted you to make the tayammum, if that is removed, then the tayammum is no longer valid, because one can do the primary, which is the wudu or the ghusl. So if you're traveling and you find water, the tayammum that you already had is gone. You just have to make wudu now. And there's no timing to the tayammum. The tayammum lasts as long as you still have wudu, right? Or as long as these two things do not happen. And with the tayammum, you can pray whatever you want. You can pray the obligatory prayer. You can pray the sunnah prayer. You can pray make-up prayers from the past. And you can pray any type of prayer because the tayammum in the Hanafi school is considered a complete alternative, a complete substitute to the wudu or the ghusl. In other schools, right, for every prayer you want to pray, every obligatory prayer you want to pray, you have to make a new tayammum. Right, so if you made tayammum at dhuhr, you prayed dhuhr, at asr you'd have to make a new one. But in the Hanafi school, you can pray fajr, dhuhr, maghrib, asr, maghrib, isha, witr, everything. Right, make qada of your witrs of the past, all with the same tayammum, as long as it doesn't break. Now we mentioned that absence of water, which includes it being too far away, is an excuse to make tayammum, right? But what if somebody says that if we just travel a little bit more, we'll definitely reach water. I expect that we're going to see water in the future, right? In the near future. Or for instance, somebody says, just stay here, I'll go get water and I'll come back. Right? And they're not going really far, they're just going to their house or something. Do you have to wait for them? What if the prayer is almost out? Do you still wait for them or no? Right, so there's a few issues related to that, because going back to the principle that there is no water, right, or it's too far. Right, so if one is reasonably sure that there is water near, meaning it's not too far, right, and how would one be reasonably sure? Say you're traveling and you see a whole bunch of birds, right, and not too far away from you, all gathering in one area. Or you see that the dry, arid ground is starting to become green. Right, that the land is starting to become green. You see trees and you see plants and everything. These are all signs that there's water near. Or you hear the ocean. Right? You can hear the waves crashing where you are. Right? Anyone's done any extensive traveling, you find strange situations. Right? And these rulings become very important to know. Right? So you're pretty sure that there's water somewhere nearby, within that 1.18 miles, it's 1.16 miles, which is equivalent to 1.86 kilometers. Right, so for our Canadian friends, 1.86 kilometers. So you're pretty sure that within 1 kilometer there's some water. Right? In that case, right, it is necessary to seek that water, to go get it, if, one, that you are reasonably sure that it's within that's what they call the Hashemite mile. Right? In Arabic it's called the mil. The mil is the 1.86 kilometers. Right? If you're pretty sure that it's less than that distance, you have to go get it. You have to go get it. Right? Even if you're in the middle of the desert. Right? If you're in the middle of the desert, but you're pretty sure that within 1.86 miles, or kilometers I should say, there's water, then you have to go get it. Right, because if it's further than that, you don't even have to get it, even if you're 100% sure it's there. You don't have to go out of your way that far. So he says, ويستحب لمن لم يجد الماء في أول الوقت وهو يرجو أن يجده في آخر الوقت أن يؤخر الصلاة إلى آخر الوقت. Now, he says that it's recommended that if a person doesn't have water at the beginning of the prayer time, and there's a lot of time left, that they can delay the prayer if they have that reasonable surety that they could find it. They have an expectation of finding the water, right, before the prayer time goes out, or actually before the recommended time for the prayer goes out, then it's recommended for them to delay the prayer and try to get the water. But recommended, not necessary. So if they find the water, then they make wudu and pray. If they don't find it, then they make tayammum and pray. But that's the recommended time, not the... So if it's asr time, right, you delay it till just before the sun starts to... The brightness of the sun starts to diminish. Right? Other than that, you can just make tayammum. Any further than that would be makruh. Right, but if you're not... So if you're reasonably sure that there is water and it's within that mile, it's less than that mile, then you have to seek it up to a ghalwa. You have to travel up to a ghalwa to seek it. Right? A ghalwa is 400 steps. 400 khutuwat. Right? Either actually or effectively. Because if you can see the distance of 400 steps, you don't have to go. You can just look. You're in an open, wide open plain. You can just look around. Right? 400 steps? Nope. You don't have to actually do the 400 steps. But if you're in like a forest or something, which would probably have lots of water, right, then you actually do the 400 steps. So just to recap, right, you have to seek the water out up to 400 steps if you are reasonably sure that the water is within that Hashemite mile, which is 1.86 kilometers or 1.16 miles. Right? So say it's 1 mile away or 1 kilometer away, but you only have to go 400 steps. If you don't see it by then you can turn around. If one is not reasonably sure, then it's not necessary, but it's still recommended to do so. Right? To still go that 400 steps. And there's another issue which is interesting, that what about the people with you? You're traveling in a group, say you're traveling on a bus in the middle of the desert from Oman to Tarim, which has happened, right? But you're in a bus full of strangers. But you don't have water, and they're not going to stop, right, at any place that has water. They might stop at some desert area for everyone to just scatter in directions and do what they have to do. Right? But they're not going to stop for you to make wudu. Do you have to ask everyone on the bus, do they have water? It's a good question. It happens. Right? Do you have to ask the other Muslims on the plane? Say the water goes out. Something happens. Right? If you're in a place where normally people would not care, they would not give you anything if you asked them, like New York City. Excuse me, sir, I got some water. Get out of my face. No, just joking. If you're in a place where people would not give the water, right, then you don't have to ask, because that would be humiliation, and is the Imam's opinion that you don't have to ask at all, but because of humiliation. But this is more practical, that if you're in a place that would be humiliating to ask for the water, then you don't have to ask. If you're in a place where they're generous and they would give you, if you ask them, they would even feed you right there turkey dinner. If you ask them, then you should ask. Right? So if you're with a group of people and you're all friends, ask, do you have any water? They say no, right? I'm not giving it to you, just make tayammum. Or somebody said, I'll sell it to you. Right? And you have extra money and the price is reasonable, right? Then you buy it. If the price is outlandish, right, double what it's worth, right, then you don't have to pay for it. Or you don't have money, or you need the money you have, you don't have to buy it. Has anybody ever been in a situation where they had to make tayammum because there's no water? You've been there?
I did. When I was younger, I actually went to a basement, right? And I from what I've heard at that time, because I couldn't go outside because I had a very bad fever. I couldn't come in contact with water, so I decided to use wood. As time moved, so I don't know if that's valid.
Yeah.
I was in high school.
Yeah. If the wood had dust on it, it would be valid. If there's manifest dust on it, especially if it's a basement, like a shelf or something, and there's clear dust on it, then it would be valid. So we should have added that, but Imam Quduri doesn't bring it, that dust is sufficient as well, because dust is considered min jinsil ard. Alright, so like some types of sand, like if you hit it, you'll have like a little, that's type of dust. So if you have like a shelf that you can see the dust, like if you were to put your hand on it, you would see like a clear spot now, like the dust. You can make tayammum on that, even if the surface itself that it's on is not jinsul ard. It's wood, but the dust is what you're using. Right? Even in the situation that you have a rock and you have dust and you use the dust, it's still valid in Hanafi school. You have a question?
I'm just wondering if it has to be manifest.
Yeah, it has to be clear, visible. Visible.
So like, say for example, you're in your house and you know that there's a place in the house that is not frequented at all,
Mm-hmm.
and the drywall on the house, let's just say,
Yeah.
you can't see it, but you know that probably there's dust. That's not enough.
No, that would be tough. That would be tough. Because the color of the wall, you might not be able to see it, but just a possibility of it being there is not enough. Right? Unless you're like, no, there's definitely dust, I just can't see it because of the color. And then that would be much more vast than just guessing. Yeah. But like the top shelf of like the furthest cabinet or something that nobody ever touches or something, then like, if you can see it, then. Right, so something that's actually from the earth, or something that has dust on it, right? Both of those are valid. I remember using the bottom of my sandals that had all kinds of like sand on it in Medina, because the janazah prayer was starting, and there's no way I'm going down three levels to make wudu, right, before the guy makes 4 takbirs. Impossible. So I flipped my sandals, made it went like that. It's probably not very cleanly, but it worked. Imam Quduri, he then goes on to, right, talking about wiping on footgear, right, which is another type of substitute. Right, so wiping on footgear is the substitute of washing the feet. It's an alternative. Alternative is a better word than substitute, because substitute, it kind of has the meaning that the primary is not there, that there's no possibility of doing that which it's a substitute for. Right, but alternative, you have a choice. You can do this or you can do this. Right, so wiping on the footgear is of that type. You have a choice. You want to wash your feet? Go ahead. You want to wipe on the footgear? Tafaddal. Right, enjoy. It is not intrinsically better to wipe on the footgear. It is better to wash the feet, but it is allowed to wipe on the footgear. There's no sin, it's not disliked to do it, but it is superior to wash the feet, because it is the primary thing. So if you had a choice, you can wipe on the socks or wash your feet. Right? It would be best to wash the feet, but there's no fault whatsoever in you. If you want to wipe on your socks, you shouldn't feel bad about yourself. Now, wiping on footgear is established by the Sunnah of the Prophet, established by the Hadith of the Prophet. There is one variant recitation of the Quran where he says وَأَرْجُلِكُمْ, right? And wash your feet, but أَرْجُلِكُمْ coming after وَامْسَحُوا بِرُؤُسِكُمْ وَأَرْجُلِكُمْ, wipe over your heads, right? And then some have assumed that arjulikum means wipe over your feet, and that applies to wiping on the socks. That is there. It is textually established as an opinion from some scholars. But Imam al-Zamakhshari, he mentioned that arjulikum is more of a thing that they would have a grammatic style of called mujawara, that because of it being after a word that has a kasra, it is given a kasra only because it's next to that word, and it flows better, not because of a grammatical change in meaning. But some of the factions or sects of Islam use that, interpret it to mean that you can wipe just on your foot. Some of the Shia, they use that to wipe on the foot, and that is not allowed in mainstream Sunni Islam. It is not allowed according to any of the schools. Right, tamam. So it is established by the hadith. Right? It's established in the hadith, right? And it's only allowed when one is making a wudu, not for ghusl. It's not allowed for ghusl. So if a person's in a state of major ritual impurity, they are not allowed to wipe on any footgear. They must remove the socks or whatever it is. We'll talk about that in a minute. All right, and wash the feet. The feet must be washed. So if you can consider ritual impurity is like, they used to have this word, aura. You know what aura means? I think it's other traditions use it to mean like some state that a person's in. Right, so consider the ritual impurities like an aura, like some sort of invisible state around you. Right, when say you break your wudu somehow, that state covers your body. But if you had the footgear on, right, with the conditions that we're going to talk about, right, that state will cover your body except for the feet. Right, it won't actually cover the feet. It'll just rest nicely on the outside of the footgear. And how do you remove it from the outside of the footgear? You wipe on it. Right, so the socks are seen as a blocker. Right? Obviously, this is all just examples, metaphors. Right? We're not saying that it actually happens. Right? But the socks are seen to block that ritual state of impurity from reaching the feet. Right, so that a person just has to wipe over the top. They don't actually have to wash the foot. So, but there are conditions. Okay, there are conditions. One, to how the footgear is worn, what constitutes as valid footgear, right? And there are conditions that relate to the person themselves. So, right, so the first condition is that both let's just use the word socks for now, right? Both socks, but footgear is more expensive than that. The Khuff was a type of sock. Both of them must be on, right? One, not just, right? Both of them must be on, and B, right? A person must attain a full state of purity before breaking their wudu. Okay, so both socks and full purity. Then it's valid. Right? When a person does break their wudu later, it is valid for them to wipe instead of washing their feet. Right? So, for instance, if a person washes their feet first in wudu, instead of washing their face first and their arms first, right? They're in a public bathroom, and they've been judged so many times putting their feet in the sink in the public bathroom. So they're like, you know what? I'm Hanafi. Why not take advantage of it? Right? I'm going to wash my feet first. Right? And then if somebody walks in later and see me wash my arms, it's not as weird. Right? So there's nobody in here now. Quickly wash my feet. Right? So he washes his feet and he puts on his leather sock or the equivalent. And he puts on both of them. Does he have full purity right now? No. So what if, right, as he's putting on the second sock, he puts it all the way on and then he breaks his wudu? Can he just do the rest of the wudu and wipe on the socks? No, because both socks were not on while the person had a full purity. He had partial purity. He washed his feet. That's all, right? But he didn't complete the wudu. Okay, so he washes his feet first. He starts over. He washes his feet. He puts on the socks. Then he washes his face. He washes his arms. He wipes his head. Now he has full wudu, and he has both socks on. Right? Now if he breaks his wudu, can he wipe on his socks? Right? Yes, instead of wiping, because he had both socks on when he had a full purity, full purification. Make sense? Right, so person makes full wudu, proper order, and then puts on the socks. That's the normal way. That's fine. That fulfills all the conditions. Right? Then if after that they break the wudu, next time they make wudu, they don't have to wash their feet. They can just wipe over the sock. Right? But if a person, for instance, they made the full wudu, and they put one sock on, and then they broke their wudu before they put the second sock on, can they wipe on their feet? No. He has to take off that one sock and wash the feet in the next wudu. Question?
Yeah, if somebody were to wash their feet and then put their socks on, leave the house, finish their wudu in the public bathroom, then wipe, is that?
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. Right? So, even though it's not really spoken this way, that if you wash your feet, it's as if your feet have wudu. Right? That part is pure, but you're required to finish the rest for you to have a full wudu that you can pray with. So if you wash your feet, and then an hour later you wash one arm, and then an hour later you wash another arm, and then an hour later you wash your face, it's against the sunnah. But as long as within that time you didn't do anything that would break a wudu, right, the wudu is valid. Right?
So that time frame doesn't...
Time doesn't matter. It's against the sunnah though, because it's sunnah to make mutawaliyah, right? Muwala, to make it continuous so that one limb doesn't dry before the next limb. Right? But that's not an obligation. Tamam. So both socks must be on, and a person must have a full state of purity before they break the wudu. Right? Then if they have those two, and then they break the wudu, then they can wipe over the sock in the next wudu. Right? But if they don't have both socks on, and then they break the wudu, right, they can't wipe. If they don't have a full wudu, even though they have the socks on, right, and they break the wudu, they can't wipe in the next one. So those two conditions, right, that he says, إِذَا لَبِسَ الْخُفَّيْنِ عَلَى طَهَارَةٍ كَامِلَةٍ, that when the person, with the condition that the person wears both footgear upon full purity, and then they break the wudu. They wear both footgears, right, both socks, upon full purity, and then they break the wudu. And then he says, فَإِنْ كَانَ مُقِيمًا, if they are a resident, I mean, they are not a traveler, right, then they can continue to wipe on that sock for 24 hours, right, one whole day. Right, and if they are a traveler, then for 72 hours. And the time starts from the time that the wudu is broken, not from the time that the wudu was made. Right? Not even from the time that the socks were put on. Right? So for instance, say I made a full wudu at 1 o'clock. Right? And then say I drank a lot of coffee, so just before Asr I needed to use the restroom. But then I realized that, wait, it's going to be really difficult for me to wash my feet, so before I use the restroom, let me put on the socks. Right? So they made wudu at 1, right? But they wore the socks at 4. Right? So then they wear the socks at 4. And then 4:30 they use the restroom. What time does the 24 hours start from? 1, 4, or 4:30? You have to say it louder. 4:30. Right? From the time that they actually broke the wudu. That's when the 24 hours starts. Right? Not from the time that they made wudu. Right? Right? And the same thing applies to the traveler. From the time that they broke the wudu, they had the socks on, right, while having the socks on, then 72 hours from that time. Quick question. Person makes wudu at 1 p.m., right? And they put on the socks at 1:30. And then they take off the socks. And then they put the socks back on at 4, and then they break the wudu at 4:30. Can they wipe on the socks? Yes. Right. So if you have a full wudu, right, the socks aren't really doing anything. They're not blocking any ritual impurity from reaching the feet, because you have full purity. Even the foot was washed. Right, so the socks, you can take them on, off, take it on, off, take it on, off. It doesn't do anything. But if you break your wudu while it's off, you have to wash your feet. If you break your wudu while it's on, then you can wipe on them. Right, we'll talk about that in a minute. Right. So the time starts from when the wudu is broken, not from when the socks are worn. There's a mistake on the slide. It should be worn, not removed. Not not when the footgear is worn. So, now the obligatory amount of wiping the sock is 3 fingers, the amount of 3 fingers. Right? Just 3 fingers. Right? Any 3 fingers, whatever 3 fingers, that size. Right? Because the hand has 5 fingers, 3 is the most, and right, the majority of something is generally given the ruling as all. Right? So you have to wipe with your hands. Right? So if you wipe 3 fingers is sufficient. Now the space of 3 fingers is sufficient, but it has to be on the top of the sock. So you wipe the bottom of the sock 3 fingers, it doesn't count. It has to be the top of the sock, right? From below the ankle, because above the ankle is not considered foot anymore. Right. Now, wiping in Arabic, masah, has 2 possible meanings. Either the process of wiping, the action itself, or the result of the action, which is something gets wet. Right. What's meant is the second. So if you made a full wudu and you put on your socks and then you walked through a wet grassy field, right, and 3 fingers of amounts of your socks got wet, that's sufficient. You don't have to actually use your hand. Right. The socks got wet to that extent, it's allowed. Same thing with the head when wiping. Right. You don't actually have to use your hand, because what's meant is not the action itself, it's the result of the action. That part gets wet. The norm is to use a wet hand and do it. Right? But if it gets wet from other than that, then it's allowed also. So for instance, you're walking outside, right, and it's pouring rain. Your face gets soaked, your arms get soaked, your feet are soaked, right, and your hair is soaked. Do you have wudu? Yes, even if you don't touch your head. Even if you don't touch your head, because the head, at least 1/4 got wet. So, right, so, but use your fingers, use your hand, 3 fingers, and to keep them separate is sunnah. 3 fingers, keeping separate, sunnah, and to wipe from the tips of the toes up to the shin with 3 fingers, right, wet fingers. So you can do 2 hands at once. So to wet the hand, and then use 3 fingers to wipe from toes all the way up to the shin on the top of the foot. In the Shafi'i school, you wipe the whole entire sock from both bottom and top. Right. It's really cool to watch it. Now, there are certain things that prevent one from being allowed to make the wiping of the sock, of the footgear. That one, if the footgear has holes in it, right? Because generally, especially in the time of the Sahaba, they would wear footgear when they traveled, right? And they would sometimes walk directly on that footgear and not on a shoe under it. They would walk just on that. So having small holes here and there was something that was common. And it was almost impossible to prevent, especially if you're walking outside. Right? But large holes, it's preventable. Large holes are not an excuse. So if there's large holes, that sock is not valid. Right? Now, they define a large hole to be that the 3 smallest toes could fit through that hole. The 3 smallest toes could fit through that hole. You don't actually have to do it, just reasonably sure. Right? Are you reasonably sure that if you were to try to put your 3 toes in that hole that you could do it? If it's that big, then you can't use it to wipe. If it's smaller than that, then you can use to wipe. If there are multiple small holes on one sock, then you would combine them and say, okay, these holes are this size. If hypothetically, if I were to join them all and make one big hole out of them, would it be the size of 3 small toes? Right? If yes, don't wipe. If no, then continue wiping. Right? You don't have to actually bring out a ruler, this many centimeters, how big is my toe? You don't have to do that. Just reasonable judgment. However, if you have, for instance, if you have a hole on your right sock that's half the size of 3 toes, and a hole in the other sock that's the other half the size of 3 toes, right? each sock is considered individually. You can wipe on those. They are not combined because they're from two different socks. Holes are combined only on one sock. Right? So you have, on the right sock, you have one hole here, one hole there, one hole here, one hole there. Right? Then you would add them together. If you have, all right, regardless of the other sock. Tamam. Right? You cannot make, so you cannot wipe on a sock that has large holes. Right? A large hole being the size of the 3 small toes. Right? You cannot make masah, you cannot wipe on socks that were worn when a person was in a state of major ritual impurity. So a person needs ghusl, they can't wear socks, right? And wipe on the socks. So they made a full wudu, they put on the socks, right? And then now they have to make ghusl, they have to take off the socks. You cannot wipe on the socks. And third, right, if the footgear does not meet the criteria of valid, right, Sharia compliant footgear, right, and that's coming in a minute. The time of the Sahaba, their footgear was called Khuff, and that was made out of leather. It would be made out of leather. Sometimes it would be, they would wear socks from other types of materials. Right? And that were either mujallad or muna'al, that would have a leather sole or a leather top. Right? So there was different types of socks that they wore, but only some of them fit the criteria of the khuff. Right? So the khuff is the leather sock. Right? So the khuff itself is completely valid, but there's other socks that fulfill the criteria of the khuff, and those are also valid. We'll do that in a minute. Tamam. We mentioned that about tayammum, what breaks the tayammum, but regarding wiping, anything that breaks the wudu would break the wiping. So in the next wudu, you'd have to re-wipe. Right, so that's one thing, that if a person falls into a state of minor ritual impurity, they leave the socks on, and then they can wipe in the next wudu. Right? If they need a ghusl, they have to take the socks off. Right? But there are other things as well that break the wiping. So, for instance, we mentioned that for the traveler, you have 72 hours. So what if, right, you have wudu, right, you made wudu, and you wiped on your socks. So your wudu, right, you use the socks in that wudu. You wipe the socks in that wudu, and then your 72 hours finishes. Right, so now, right, what you washed is still valid. Right, your face, your arms, your wiping, all that's still valid. But the feet now, right, are considered in the state of impurity. You'd have to take off the socks and re-wash the feet only. You don't have to redo the whole wudu. Right? But say, for instance, you use the restroom, right, and then you're heading to the wudu khana, right, the wudu area, and on your way, the 72 hours finished. Right, so when the 72 hours finished, you didn't have wudu at all. You don't have any type of wudu. So now what do you have to do? You have to do the whole entire process, right, including removing the socks and washing the feet. Right, so right, if you see everything individually, right, your arms, your face, none of that was pure at that time. So it's just right, back to normal. Right, but if you already washed your face and your arms and you wiped your head, you just have to take off the socks and re-wash them, and then put them back on if you like. Right? And then a new 72 hours would start from the next time you break your wudu. So if one was in a state, if the time expires and one is already in the state of purity, then only the feet need to be washed. Right? The socks are removed and the feet are re-washed, and then you continue. Ala barakatillah. Right? If a person was not in a state of purity, then they have to make a full wudu. Remove the socks, wash the feet, or make a full wudu. So, Imam Quduri doesn't bring it up here, at least I don't believe he does, that if one of the socks, let alone both, are removed, then one has to wash their feet again. Right? If a person says, you know what, I got an itch on my foot, let me just take off my leather sock, right? If it's being used, meaning you already broke your wudu and you wiped on it, right? So you made your wudu, right? You washed your feet entirely, then you put on the socks, right? Then you broke your wudu later on the day, so you remade another wudu and then you wiped on the socks. So now you're using the socks, you're actually using the socks, right? And then you're like, you know, I got an itch on my ankle, so let me take off the sock completely and scratch it and then put it back on. Now, once you take off one sock, right, the wiping of the socks breaks. You have to rewash both feet, right, and put the socks back on to continue. So taking off one, right, even one sock breaks the wiping of both feet, which would include taking off, right, taking the foot out of the sock, the majority of the foot out of the sock. So even if you don't take it off 100%, just like hanging on your toes or something, right, it still breaks if majority of the foot came out. Some say that the actual heel of the foot comes out from the top, then that's broken. But if you just pull it down a little bit, right, then it doesn't break. So I believe he mentions that here because it's a Mukhtasar, right? It's a concise abridgment. Another issue that they mention is just kind of like a bouncing around of other types of issues, hypothetical situations, you could say. That if a person is a resident and they start wiping, how long do they have? How long can you wipe as a resident? 1 day, 24 hours. But what if 12 hours into the day you start traveling? You're already out of the city limits and you're intending a place that's over, right, say 80 kilometers or something. Right? You're a traveler. Right? So now, right, you just increase it to 3 days. Right? So whatever time you already used, right, and right, you have up until 72 hours from that time. So you would just add to it. So say you already used 12 hours of the day, right, then you have, right, 60 hours left. Right? So you would consider, right, that now you're a traveler and the time continues. But what if you are a traveler? You wore the socks, right? You've been using the socks for 12 hours now, and now you're home, right? So then you have 12 more hours, because now you're a resident. You got up to 24 hours. Right? But what if you're a traveler and you've been using the sock for a day and a half? A day and a half, right? Say you're using the socks for 30 hours, right? But now you enter your city limits, you get home, right? Now, what happens? As soon as you enter your city limits, your wudu is gone, because, right, and you have to rewash your feet if you're already in the state of wudu, right? Because the resident is only allowed 24 hours and you're way over that time, right? So, but as long as you're still a traveler, right, that continues. But as soon as you enter your city limits and you're no longer a traveler, right, you must take off the socks and rewash your feet. So you would consider the final, the final ruling. So if you're a resident and then you're a traveler, right, how much time did you use of that 72 hours? If you're a traveler and then a resident, how much time did you use compared to that 24 hours? So a lot of discussions, right? A lot of issues here. But it's pretty straightforward. Last issue that we want to cover is probably the one that everyone's waiting for, if anyone's watching this chapter, watching this class. What kind of socks can you wipe on? The big pink elephant in the room, right, that no one's talking about. Can I wipe on regular socks? That's what everyone wants to know. Right, so we mentioned already that the Khuff at the time of the Sahaba was customarily made of leather. That's what they wore. Right. However, Right? The Hanafi school does not just look at what they did. They look at that. They don't just look at the sock being leather, right? But they look at the sock having certain qualities that are also found in other things. Right? The qualities of that sock was that it's thick, it's sturdy, and that it's right, and so forth. We'll list them now. Right? So anything else that is thick and sturdy and so forth that has those same criteria would also be valid to make to wipe on. So the criteria are that one, the sock must cover above the ankles. It must cover the ankles. So like those really little socks that just cover the bottom of the feet, you can't wipe on those. It has to cover the entire foot. And the foot is everything from the ankles, including the ankles, down. Right? From the ankles down. So the ankles are part of the foot. The entire foot must be covered. Now if you can see from the top down, it doesn't matter. That's fine. Because some leather socks are really like kind of loose on the top, but you can see through them. That's fine. It doesn't have to be hugging your foot. Tamaman. Right? But there are other criteria that are important to remember. Right, the second is that it's thick. Now some books they mention thick, some books mention about water not being able to go through, and some mention that you can't see the skin. All of that goes back to thick. Right, so thick is fits all of that. Some say that, right, some books they mention about that you can walk right, in a customary way a certain distance and they wouldn't rip. Again, going back to thickness. Right, so the socks must be thick, and the criteria of knowing whether it's thick or not is either one, that you could walk in it, I believe it's 2 miles, if I'm not mistaken. It's 2 miles, right? So around about 2 miles or so, in that sock without any shoe under it, just bare sock to the ground. That sock to the ground for 2 miles in a normal way. You don't have to stomp like you're a marching like army man. Right? In a normal way of walking for 2 miles, and they won't have large holes in it at the end. Right? This has been tested. Right? Shaykh Faraz mentioned that they've had hundreds of people try this, and none of the socks ripped. Even some of the socks that were close to thin, right? Even like the kind of flimsy socks that they added as like as a test subject, one of those, just to see, right? Not because it might not fit the other criteria, but even those kind of socks lasted. So most thick, sturdy, normal socks, even if they're cotton, right, wouldn't rip on a normal walk. It might not be very comfortable, right, but they would be considered thick. Right, so a lot of people have a lot of they're very irritable when these issues come up. Right, but the fiqh is what the fiqh is. We leave emotions aside. Right, if one doesn't want to do that, use the leather sock. Tafaddal, go ahead, use the leather sock. Khuruj min al-khilaf, mustahab. Tamam. The sock must be free of large holes. We already mentioned that. Number 4, the sock must remain on the foot without the help of any tying. That you don't. It stays on the foot by itself. It doesn't. You don't have to tie it in order for it to stay. That if you didn't tie it, it would just fall to the ground. Right? That it could stay on the foot without being tied. And the 5th one is that the water does not immediately reach the foot when wiped. So if you had a soaking wet hand, right? I'm not going to put my foot on the table. Okay, if you had a soaking wet hand, right, and you wiped on the sock, can you feel the water immediately? Right when you touch the sock, can you feel the water on your foot? Right, most times, no. You might feel some warmth or a temperature, right? You might feel the temperature of the water or this or that. Right? But if you can't feel the water itself, and wetness immediately goes to your foot, then that's considered thick. Again, the thick is usually used as encompassing a few different conditions. Right? If as soon as you wipe on it, your foot's wet, you feel the wetness, then that's too thin. That sock is too thin. It is not a condition that the sock is waterproof. It is not a condition that the sock is completely waterproof. Right? The condition is mentioned in the book is la yashifani al-ma', la yashifan. Right? Some books la yashifani al-ma', some books la yashifani. right? And they're close in meaning. One is that it doesn't soak up the water. The water doesn't immediately reach the foot as soon as you wipe it. It might reach it later. That's fine, right? Later on. But immediately, as soon as you touch it, does the water reach the foot? If not, then that's good. You can use those socks. Right? Even if 5 minutes later, then you feel the wetness, that's fine. The other meaning of la yashifani is that you can't see the skin through it. Right? So they're pretty much the same. If you can see the skin through the top of the sock, I'm pretty sure water is going to make it through. So they're pretty much, they all add up to the similar criteria. Right? Tamam. So you'll see that in different books they express it in different ways, but they all go back to the same essential criterion. Imam Abu Hanifa had a bit of a stricter opinion that you can only, as Imam Quduri he says, ولا يجوز المسح على الجوربين عند أبي حنيفة إلا أن يكونا مجلدين أو منعلين. He says that you cannot make masah, wiping on jawrab. A jawrab is a normal type of sock, a non-leather sock you could say, unless they have a leather top or a leather bottom. And so, unless they have leather in it, whereas Imam Abu Yusuf, Imam Muhammad, they said, you can wipe on that type of sock if they are thick, la yashifani al-ma, and they do not soak in the water. So you see the same criteria branching out from that. One last issue, which is important, that there's only two things that are allowed to be wiped in the Sharia, in purification. There's only two things that are allowed to be wiped as an alternative to washing that limb in wudu, right? Or in one case, ghusl, right? Which is the socks that we just mentioned, right? Only as an alternative to washing the feet in wudu, right? Or a bandage, or some sort of cast, or a bandage, or which would be a substitute. Wiping over the bandage is a substitute to washing that which is under it, whether it's wudu or ghusl. Because somebody breaks their arm, you're not going to tell them, go take a shower first, and then I'll see you in the ER. Right? We mentioned already that undue difficulty is completely averted in the religion, right? And to the extent that is necessary. Right? So it's not a condition that the bandage is worn on a state of purity, right? None of that. But besides those two, you cannot wipe on anything. Nothing else is allowed. So Imam Quduri, he says, وَلَا يَجُوزُ الْمَسْحُ عَلَى الْعِمَامَةِ. It is not permissible to wipe over one's turban. Right? وَالْقَلَنْسُوَةِ, nor one's hat. So say I make wudu, I can't just wipe over my hat instead of wiping my head. Right? وَالْبُرْقَعِ, I can't wipe over my niqab. The burqa is that which covers the face, right? Which would also mean like the hijab, you can't wipe over that. وَالْقُفَّازَيْن, or the gloves, right? And the Arabs, they used to wear gloves because they would train hawks, like eagles and hawks, to sit on their arms, and they have claws. So the talons, the falcons have the talons, right? So they would have the leather khuffaz, the glove. So it's leather, it's like a sock, right? No, you can't wipe over that, you have to wash your arm, right? So only the bandages, right, which we'll talk about in another class, right, and the footgear are allowed to wipe over as a substitute for washing that which is under it. And then he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, so I don't know why this is, so this is really crowded. So you're allowed to wipe on the khuff or the like. We can talk about the criteria to be similar to the khuff. Right? You can wipe on bandages or splints. Right? And it's not a prerequisite that they be put on in a state of purity, for obvious reasons. Right? Now, they mentioned that what if you have a bandage, right? And this is probably not so common now because the way that bandages are putting on now. What if it falls off? right, by itself. You have like a Band-Aid or something. You have a deep cut and you just put a Band-Aid over it. I remember I sliced my finger open during Eid al-Adha, right, during Qurbani, and this one Guyanese guy said, just put a Band-Aid on it. It's tough guy. And I need 3 stitches. It wasn't like a small cut. Right, but say I have a Band-Aid on, for instance, right? And I wipe over the Band-Aid, but sometimes the Band-Aids, they lose their stickiness, their adhesive qualities, for a better word, right? And they fall off. So you say you're praying and it falls off. Right? Now if it falls off, what do? I wiped over it. Okay. So they mentioned that if it falls off, right, obviously, so you instead of washing that part, which would be difficult, you just wipe over the bandage, actually, or majority of it is sufficient. Right? If it falls off, then if the wound is cured, then you have to wash that spot. So if you were in the middle of the prayer would break. Right? If you look down and all of a sudden it's better, it's been a few days now and now it's completely healed, right? I'd have to go wash that spot because my wudu is incomplete, and then go back to the prayer. Right, but if it fell off, right, and if it fell off and the wound is still there and it's not cured yet, right, then you can just continue your prayer. Right? You can put a bandage back on it, right, a new bandage or the same one back on, and then it's recommended to re-wipe over it, but it's not necessary. Because when it comes to bandages, wiping over it is a substitute for washing under it. It's as if you washed that which is under it. Right? So if it fell off and the excuse is still there, the thing is still a wound that you would need to be covered, right, then it's as if you washed under it anyway. So it doesn't break the wudu. But if it was cured, then the excuse is gone. An excuse being gone, إِذَا زَالَ الْعُذْرُ, when the excuse goes away, then that which it's a substitute for also it becomes unnecessary. So if the wound was not cured yet, right, then the wiping still remains valid. The wiping that you did earlier, right, as a substitute for washing what's under it, right, is still valid. You can continue your prayer. You don't have to, right, go and wash the spot now. But it would be recommended to re-wipe if you replace the bandage with something new. It would be recommended to re-wipe, but not necessary. There are other issues that Imam Quduri kind of leaves out just because of the brevity of things. Like just a few small issues, really quickly. If a person makes wudu and they wipe on their head and then they shave their hair off, they don't have to re-wipe their head. Right? Or if you make wudu and then you cut your nails, you don't have to re-wash your fingers. Right? Or if you wash your face and then you cut your mustache, you don't have to re-wash your lips. Right? There's a few things like that, all of the similar vein. So, are there any questions? This is a bit heavy. I covered a lot today.
My first question was related to the bandages as well. What if, how big of an excuse do you need to have a bandage? Like some people will put on a bandage for the slightest of things.
Yeah.
And is that still a valid excuse to wipe over it? You're just trying to avoid a small stain.
It's a good question. If what is averted is darar. Right? Darar is harm. Right? Darar is usually defined as something that if you were to take 10 normal people, that they couldn't handle it. That would be darar. If you were to ask 10 normal people, could you handle the sting of a paper cut without too much like trauma, or post-traumatic, what is it, stress disorder or something? And they would say, yeah, most likely. So, and that would not be considered sufficient difficult harm that you can't use the water. Right? But if the water would cause pain, like a high level of pain, or the water would stop it from being cured, or elongate the process that would cause the cure, then you can use a bandage instead over it and wipe over it. But generally, if you can wash it, you have to wash it. If washing hurts, right, then the second level would be putting a bandage and wiping over the bandage. If that even hurts, right, sorry, the second level would be to take a wet hand and wipe over the actual skin, the actual wound itself. Right? If one can't do that, then the bandage comes in. Right, so that's a third level. Right? Another issue would be that if the bandage is bigger than the wound itself. Right? So I broke my wrist when I was young, right? But they covered my hand all the way up to the elbow. Right? If it's there, it's there. You can't go back and say, please make this smaller. Right? If it's there, just wipe. You have to wipe majority of it. Right? But if the bandage is bigger than the wound, right, then the same thing applies. If it causes difficulty to undo it and wash, then you don't have to. You can just wipe on majority of it. Right? And another issue that they bring is that this applies to there's an issue on tayammum that we didn't mention, that the absence of water, the inability to use the water, right, are excuses for tayammum. Right, both of them. There's no water, or you can't use the water, right, for a sickness or something. But if your sickness, you can't make wudu because you can't move to make the wudu, right, you can also make tayammum. Right, so somebody has like back spasms, severe back spasms, and they can't even bend down to the sink or something. Right? So, or they can't get off the hospital bed to go to the sink. Right? That's also sufficient. They don't have to get someone to make wudu for them every single time. Right? Obviously, if the person is there and cheerful and how can I help and here, okay, sure, I'll make wudu for you. Right? That's fine once or twice. But if it's continuously and continuous, you don't have to burden people by having them make wudu for you, or even a stinja, right? Because people and elderly people have medical issues. These things come up. Right? So it is not, you have to wait there for the nurse to come to clean you and to take you to make wudu, right? In order for you to pray every single time you want to pray. Right? No, right? You can make tayammum. Right? So if you can't even get to the water, right? The water is right there, but you can't move, you don't have to make tayammum. You don't have to make wudu. There was one other issue, that if a person, that's has really nuanced details. I want to check it first. We'll talk about it in the next class. The person has wounds all over their body. So somebody has a road rash or something. They fell on their bike, and right, may Allah make things easy for us. But if it happened and they have wounds everywhere, right, then if majority of their limbs are wounded, then they can make tayammum instead. Right? But there's a difference between the details of wudu and ghusl. So we'll talk about that in a minute, next time, inshallah. Any other questions? Yeah, two questions, right?
The other one, just out of curiosity.
You know what curiosity does to the cat, right? Okay, go ahead.
For the Khuffs, the walking distance of 2 miles, did they mention the terrain that it has to be?
No. No, it says mashul mu'tad, right? A customary walking. Right, so is like climbing the Kilimanjaro customary for most people? No. Just wherever you are, just walk. Okay. It's been done for you, so you don't have to try. It's been done, tried and tested. Right, but these things, even though wiping on the socks is not ideal, it's still better to wash the feet. But if a person has circumstances, or them doing that constantly, making wudu at work or something, may be something distasteful to the non-Muslims, and it might stop them from even considering Islam, because they think they have to put their feet in the sink. Right? Like they think it's like the 6th pillar of Islam or something, to put your feet in the sink. Right? Then you pick your battles. Right? If you can avert harm to others, or if you're at somebody's house, right, and you don't want to like wet their countertops or something, right, or or whatever, and you already have your socks on, you already had wudu when you don't need an intention. Right? You had socks on, you had wudu, you broke your wudu, socks were on. Right? You don't have to. Or if you're in a hurry, you don't have to take off your socks to wash your feet. Or if it's cold, or there's a lot of reasons why one might do that, but it's important not to be lazy, right? Not to do it just out of pure laziness. Right? Because, but even if one did it out of pure laziness, it's still valid as long as they fit the criteria. Right? And one holds themselves accountable just for laziness in general. So, is there anything else you had? Of the curiosity?
So, what happens if, are you allowed to, if you have a thick enough sock and you have shoes on,
Yeah.
take shoes off?
It's a good question. If the shoes fit the criteria of masah by themselves, then you don't have to take them off. Right? But if you already wiped on the sock, right? So say for instance, you make wudu, full wudu, you wash your feet, and you put on your sock, right? And then you put on a type of a shoe, or right, say like your leather boot that goes above your ankle also, right? And then you break your wudu. You can wipe on the boot itself, even if you didn't have a sock under it, because the boot would fulfill the criteria. It stays by itself. The water doesn't go through it, right? You can walk a sufficient distance without breaking, right? So you can just wipe on that. But if for instance, you made full wudu, you put on the sock, just the socks, then you broke your wudu. Next wudu, you wipe on the socks, right? And then you put shoes on top of it. You have to take off the shoe and wipe on the sock, because the sock itself is what's being used, not right. But in the previous example, the shoe is what's stopping the impurity from reaching the foot. So now, if you took off the shoe, it would break. You'd have to wipe on. You'd have to rewash the feet. Tamam.
Just additional question to this one. So if you wipe on your shoes, then you have to keep them on when you pray?
Yeah, so if you took it off, then that wiping wouldn't count. You would have to wash the feet. Right? If you had the socks on all at the same time, right, then if you took off the shoe, the sock would be a sufficient. Right? It's a good question, actually. Would it? It's tricky questions. You guys are very creative today. If a person is wiped on their shoe and then they took the shoe off and they had the sock under it, do they have to take off the sock and wash the foot, or could they just wipe on the sock? It's a good question. I don't know. Allah knows best. La adri nisf al-ilm. Not I don't know is half of knowledge. It's funny because mostly in these days it's la adri nisf al-ilm. I don't know half of knowledge. Change the dhamma to a fatha, it changes the meaning tamaman. Because la adri is mubtada. And nisful ilm is khabar. La adri nisfal ilm, then it becomes the maf'ul. Tamam. Any last questions? See Hamza? Online?
Somebody asked the story you said about how you struck the bottom of your sandals in Medina. Why did that work?
Yeah, my sandals were covered in soil, like sand, dirt. So I'm wiping on the sand, not the material of the shoe. Right, so it just happened that the sand was on the shoe. If I flipped over my sandals, say they were like completely smooth, and there was no dust or no sand, I couldn't use it because rubber is not a jinsul ard, unless you had like a stone shoe, which would be really cool, but probably very masjid unfriendly. Right? Tiles of Masjid Nabawi. No.
Someone else was asking, what if they have impurities on there?
If they have impurities on the khuff, good, right? So if anyone has, like for instance, a shoe, right, or like a leather sock or something, and then they step in something, right? Then what's the way to purify it is just to rub it against the ground. Right? And that would be sufficient to purify it. right? Because if it is a liquid substance, right, then it mixing with the soil or of the ground, right, would dry it up, and then it would fall off. It would come off, right? So the Prophet ﷺ said that if any of you enter the masjid, then let them look at the bottom of their feet. If there's any adha, if there's any impurities, then they would wipe their feet and then go in, because they would generally pray with their shoes on, right? And their shoes at that time, right, they didn't have like wall-to-wall carpets that would be ruined by shoes, right? So any other questions online? None on the topic? There's none. There's other questions? If it's not related at all, just give an example.
Okay, somebody wants some advice on time management, how they can, they want to devote more time to memorize the Quran.
Yeah, that's way off topic. There's a lot of answers on the Seeker's website regarding this, but generally one should prioritize that which is most important and start with that. Start with something small that they could do consistently every day, and build on that over time. So if someone wants to memorize Quran, whatever minimum they could do every single day, that make that their minimum and never leave it. Right. And especially in Quran, more time should be divided, right, for the sake of revision than for the sake of new memorization. And right, generally, any time management question goes back to one thing: schedule. Having a schedule. Right. Imam Ghazali, he says that people who do whatever they want, whenever they want, they just kind of wing it throughout the day without any a schedule, right? Then they end up wasting time whether they like it or not. If you have a specific schedule, is really important, and never to leave it. So, we'll stop there, inshallah. We went over the time. وصلى الله تعالى على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم الحمد لله رب العالمين والله أعلم. What other questions are on there? We're still live? Is this? No. Is this